We will bring back trillions in business wealth, and this is wealth that's parked overseas. Nobody knows how much it is. They say it's $2.5 trillion. I have people that think it's $5 trillion. We'll bring them back, and it'll be taxed only at the rate of 10% instead of 35%. By taxing it at 10% instead of 35%, all of this money will come roaring back into our country, and lots of good things will start to happen. We will turn America into a new magnet for new jobs, and that means jobs in our poorest communities. Republicans and Democrats agree that this should be done. $2.5 trillion. I happen to think it's double that. It's probably $5 trillion that we can't bring into our country, Lester. And with a little leadership, you'd get it in here very quickly, and it could be put to use on the inner cities and lots of other things, and it would be beautiful.
Because people live together, it is inescapable that they must share some costs, such as those for roads, schools, and emergency services. As a result, they must have provisions in place to raise revenues. This demand is as old as man. Today, it plays out in who will be taxed, and for what, and for how much. The politicians are never honest on the subject because they know that no one wants to pay for anything. This goes double for the rich, who can pay the politicians to write the laws in their favor. The politicians are lying about the offshore accounts of the multinational corporations. Instead of admitting that these multinational corporations have found a way to evade taxation on their profits from business in America, they argue about how unfair the tax rates are, how those rates are hurting business and killing jobs, and how giving them amnesty for their tax evasion will be good for the economy. It is sickening to listen to these lies. Even for wonks, tax law is very boring. To make this flim-flam easier to understand, I want to work with a few charts. The first diagram we're going to look at is basic business accounting. So we start with a company, and we can call it GE, and it has a market, which we can call America, and it produces and sells to the market products, and in exchange, it receives money. This is also called revenues. These revenues have to be accounted for. A business will start with its gross revenues, the total amount of money that it received, which can also be called the top line. And from this number, you'll subtract the cost of supplies, the cost of expenses, and this includes fixed costs, employee costs, operating expenses, and quite often interest on loans. You also subtract out depreciation. This is typically for such items as facilities, equipment, and vehicles. And all these expenses are subtracted, and you wind up with your profit. Diagram number 2 concerns what happens to the profits. If you're a normal business, such as you own a McDonald's, well, you would pay tax on those profits. But multinational corporations don't want to pay taxes. I mean, that's not unusual. That's how everybody is. Nobody wants to pay. So the question is, how do you get the profits out of America? Diagram number 3 illustrates how the multinational corporations do this. So you start with the company in America, which you can call GE1. And it delivers product and receives revenue and then has a profit, ideally. And it has a related company, GE number 2, which is based in the Cayman Islands. The reason it's based there is there's no tax. And so what happens is the profit is transferred to the related company, which then deposits it into a bank. What's key to this is that something has to be going the other way. There's many ways to do this. Company number 2 can charge company number 1 for the supplies that company number 1 uses. There can be a royalty agreement. There's many, many ways to do this. It doesn't really matter. But now what has happened is the profit that is earned by doing business in America exists in the Cayman Islands. The problem is, once the money is in the Cayman Islands, it's stuck. And so the question becomes, how do you get it back to America? The politicians are arguing that if the multinational corporations are granted a tax amnesty on this money, that is, that all tax that they avoided paying would be forgiven, or that the money would just be subject to a very small amount of tax, that the corporations could then use that money to invest in local businesses. For example, let's say that our company wants to build a windmill factory in Detroit. What the politicians are saying is the only way GE can do this is if they're allowed to bring back their money that they stashed offshore. This is a bald-faced lie. The truth is that GE could bring this money back for the purposes of investment without any tax implication. It could come back in the form of a loan or an investment. Or I'm sure there are other financial vehicles that would work just as well. Then GE could build its windmill factory in Detroit. But the fact of the matter is, GE does not want to build a windmill factory in Detroit. GE wants to build its factories in China and other places where the cost of production is much lower. It wants to produce its products in places where employee standards are not respected Workplace safety is not heavily regulated, and there's no concern for the environmental standards. All that cuts the cost and increases their profit. The reality is, when the politicians are saying that GE wants to bring this money back, is it's not going to go for investment. It's going to go for the executives, the board members, and the large shareholders. The public is not going to get any benefit from that at all. The multinational corporations made a conscious decision to evade their civic responsibility. They want to be supported by the tax-paying public, even to the extent of begging for bailouts when their fraud crashes the economy. But they don't want to pay 1 cent in taxes. Here are some of the main offenders. Apple, $216 billion offshore. Microsoft, $110 billion offshore. General Electric, $100 billion offshore. Pfizer, $72 billion offshore. IBM, $65 billion offshore. These corporations should not now be rewarded for their corruption. In a word, that would not be fair. Moreover, the last time this same move was made was in 2004, and the record is clear that the amnesty produced none of the promised benefits. These multinational corporations should live with their decision. They should be able to grease the palms of some dictators in Africa. Let them start buying land there and start the process of developing an international solar power system. It is inevitable that man will have to give up the use of fossil fuels. At this point, 2/3 of the species which existed 100 years ago are now extinct, and man is not in good shape. The food, water, and air are all contaminated, and we are seeing increases in disease. Let these multinational corporations make an investment in man's future. This is the responsible thing to do, and this is better than to let a few rich people have more money to buy penthouses and diamonds.